Hello and welcome. My name is Ivan Kirigin with Tango.vc. Today I'm sharing a discussion with my friend Aston Motes. Aston has founded multiple companies, was the first employee at Dropbox, and is now helping run a very important organization called DevColor, which helps support Black software engineers in their careers. This was recorded as we're seeing nationwide protests in response to a police murder of a Black man. It's a really hard time for a lot of people. In our discussion, we cover how the world of tech startups can do better. We cover how he got into startups coming out of MIT, how he became employee number 1 at Dropbox, how Dropbox built a culture focused on quality. We discuss founder market fit, craftsmanship, and how Aston has found success in optimizing for learning in his career. We discuss how to change the culture to get more people to found companies, how a cheap lifestyle can help, how kids impact decision. We cover how DevColor helps Black engineers and how to scale that mission, how to make the best environment for Black engineers, how to hire women and underrepresented minorities, and finally, how to support DevColor. Spoiler alert, go to devcolor.org and learn more about what they do. I really enjoyed this discussion. I think Aston is one of the smartest and nicest people in tech. So without further ado, I bring you Aston Motes. All right, today I'm joined by Aston Motes, my longtime friend in the startup world. Welcome, Aston.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So I figured we could start out with just a brief introduction on sort of your arc going from school to where you are now, and we could dive in.
Yeah, okay, going all the way back to school. So I went to MIT, studied computer science. While I was there, I learned that there was this world of startups, and I credit Paul Graham and his writings primarily for that. And what I learned not only about the world, but also about myself, is that startups are really fun. And so coming out of school, my goal was to start a company. While I was at school, I started working on company ideas with a couple friends of mine, and we built I guess you would call it a book exchange website that was really popular at MIT. So I have a math book I used last semester. You can have it if you give me the psychology textbook I'm going to need next semester. It ran even after we left school. Very successful startup, not a very successful business. We never made a single cent from it. And I think coming out of that experience, we had this aspiration that, again, based on what we read from Paul Graham and what we were seeing, that we could build something that could be really, really valuable. We actually applied to YC together and did not get in. And I credit that as one really big foundational moment in my entrepreneurial journey, because it taught me modesty or maybe some realism about my ability to really go out and attack the world. So,
did you take it personally?
No, I didn't take it personally at all. Actually, I think it was the right decision by YC. What they saw about us as a team was that we were very, very talented people who were hedging our bets. We all had jobs lined up, or in case an internship, because we weren't sure that we were going to do it. And also we had some sense of ideas that we were excited about, but we didn't have an idea that we were like, this is it. This is what we really, really, really want to do. And so I think YC correctly kind of saw that we were not in exactly the right position to start something as that team. Fast forward just a few months though, one of the people that I applied to Y Combinator with ended up joining this company called Dropbox. And at the time, Dropbox was used by about 50 people and had one person, the founder Drew, working on it. And my good friend Arash, who ended up being the co-founder of Dropbox, jumped on with him.
So when I didn't know this, when you first applied to YC with BookX, it was called, right? The exchange, that was co-founded with Arash.
Yes. And it messes up the story arc, but I might as well jump forward because it's also really interesting. The other person that we were working on BookX with was this guy called McInerney, who founded this company, DevColor. So this is really, really far forward jump, but currently that's my job. So I'm the interim executive director at DevColor, and DevColor is a nonprofit focused on advancing the careers of Black software engineers. So in a lot of ways, that moment, which again I think is kind of foundational for me as an entrepreneur, was the seed that grew into the two biggest organizations I've ever been a part of. One, Dropbox, which is a multi-billion-dollar public company now, and two, DevColor, which is my job, but also kind of my passion and this project that I think does a lot of good for the world. So I apologize for not exactly answering the question, but it's just kind of a cool thing that started in college with these people who I just like to work with. I guess I should fill in the dots a little bit. So I was at Dropbox for about 4.5 years, worked primarily on the website and on the API, and started both of those teams and built them out to kind of the small version that they were in the very early days. And I think from there, people have taken those platforms well beyond what we ever imagined, which is awesome to see. And after leaving Dropbox, I did Y Combinator myself with a company that didn't really work out, but did set the stage for me to make a transition in my career from primarily software and tech to a career in tech and music. Music's a longtime passion of mine, and I basically spent about a half decade in music and tech, and just kind of ended that right before taking over this role at Def Color. So time spent as an early employee, time spent as a founder, and now time spent as somewhat of a founding member of, but now kind of executive in a nonprofit.
Awesome. There's so much to dive into there. It's it's a reflection of your incredible success. This story is awesome. I actually did not know that Mackinday was your co-founder in this college level startup, because I knew Mackinday at Facebook before, maybe like a little bit after we first met. I think we first met, correct me if I'm wrong, if you have a better memory here, at a YC poker game at the Discuss office. I want to say that's like very
Sounds
likely.
right, yes.
And there's a few others. I think Dropbox was like 6 or 7, maybe 8 people at the time. And so I met a few Dropboxers there. And at the time I was doing a startup. And then after that, I went to Facebook where I met Mackinday, and we worked together a little bit. I joined Dropbox in part because I thought the product was so incredible and very underrated. And so there's this period of time for the first 3-4 years where Dropbox was like not really in the news. You're just building and grinding and growing, actually a very large user base. And then around the Series B had a debut. And so there's a lot of interesting things around that. The one I wanted to ask you, just culturally at Dropbox, especially being employee number one, I think you have some influence over this, but also, as part of an environment, is Dropbox had a very strong focus on quality. And I think it's very interesting to see company culture evolve like that. And so the specific question I have is, how do you think the culture was influenced to build that focus on quality?
First, before I get into kind of what was special at Dropbox about it, I just want to make a comment in general about the market that Dropbox was in. I think there's a long line of startups doing what you might broadly call online storage. And I don't know if any of them, as kind of the first order thing that they were trying to solve, was quality. Quality captured not just in sort of, how does the software look, but how well does it perform? Does it retain data reliably? Can you reliably go back in a context where you have no files and go get the files that you need? I truly believe that it was a differentiator for Dropbox in a market that was much more about like easy accessibility and fun, or like, hey, this makes sense that you have an internet and a hard drive in the cloud, so we should just do it. And sometimes it messes up, but it's fine. It's the internet, it's the cloud. So I think it was a foundational thing for Dropbox to be focused on quality and to be focused on reliability, performance, security in those ways. And so if you took a business case view of this, it's just something you would decide. If you really looked at the market, you would say someone should be the reliable choice. But that's not actually what happened at Dropbox. I think it's a testament to kind of the quality of the founder market fit here. But I think Drew and Arash, as founders of Dropbox, were just extremely quality oriented people. And the word I actually use when I talk about early Dropbox is actually craft. We hired a lot of craftsmen. We hired people who took extreme pride in the work that they did and were excited to hold up to the world the beautiful or reliable or super efficient engineering that they had done. And if we hadn't had those people early on, I don't think it would have worked. But it wasn't so much that we were shopping for those people as we were those people, and that the people that we were looking to hire were those people too. So, I think again, you can kind of take the outside view of it and say, when I go build my company, I'm going to make sure that I figure out what the market needs, and then I become that thing. But I think it's like way more valuable to do what happened at Dropbox, and I think it was a little bit lucky, but to be really intentional about working on things where your skills match what the market needs. And that founder market fit was just so incredibly strong for Drew and Araj that I'm not sure they could have built any other company together and had anywhere near the success. And I do know for a fact, based on what we've seen, that just like that combination of those two was, market dominating effectively.
Yeah,
I will also
interesting.
say I came into the company a little less inclined on those things. So as the one person designated, at least initially, on building for the web, I came in with much more of what Facebook kind of always talked about as the move fast and break things mindset, which is, hey, like we can ship code, it's fine, we can fix it. It takes 2 minutes to deploy. Why not? And through my journey at Dropbox, I think I really learned the value of taking a more patient approach towards product development, taking a more careful approach toward deployment and towards system administration. And I think, one of the benefits of spending time at an early stage company, but not being the founder, is that you get to learn it and make those mistakes, of which I made lots, on somebody
Hmm.
else's dime, so that when I went to build future things, I think I had a good balance, right? So there are things I worked on that I have come and totally just like put whatever out that needs to be out there, because this is the type of opportunity that feels like it needs to be that way. But I've also been able to dial that back and say, let's be more patient here, let's build the right thing. And I tend to think of myself as kind of that person who plays the middle, and that's maybe one of my entrepreneurial strengths. So I really honed that at Dropbox.
Hmm. Yeah, that quality versus what the web allows for is interesting. I mean, I personally worked in growth in a few different companies, and it's much more not so much move fast and break things, like because there's a lot more analytics involved, and you can mess up your analytics and not know how an experiment goes. But it's definitely very iterative, and so you have to like see this, see that, be make sure everything's on the table as far as what you could change. And so what you said about sort of founder product fit, founder market fit, there's definitely something there where like I just know I'm biased towards that certain view of the world, and I don't think I could build like a craftsman quality product like just from scratch. I think I would choose to build different things or bring on co-founders that had a certain mentality that can complement me.
Right.
And so there's all sorts of ways to approach that. And so you've had a journey outside of Dropbox, and in other places you've talked about focusing on learning. And so when you thought about doing your own startup after Dropbox, like what dimension did you think was the most like ripe for most fruitful for what to learn, and pursuing that?
Yeah, so let me first say a little bit more about kind of learning and how it's guided my career. I The reason I ended up at MIT is because I like to learn, and MIT is kind of a learner's paradise. There's a bunch of people who also like to learn around that you can learn from, but more to the point, it's a school that assumes that you will learn a lot in a short amount of time, and if you don't, you will not succeed. So I think I came into my career as a technologist, as a person really, really excited about learning new things. And software also gives you lots of those opportunities. There's always a new framework to teach yourself, or a new programming language to play around in. And I think startups is learning on as many dimensions as you can take, or maybe more, as many as exist in the world. So that was always exciting to me. In terms of my career, I've always sort of measured how well a thing is going, based in large part on kind of how quickly I'm learning. So if you think about kind of the standard, you know, machine learning approach to things, you kind of think of a gradient, right? Like there's a slope of a hill, and like your learning rate is fastest when the slope is strong. Or if you think of minimization problem, I guess going down. And when I start to feel that gradient flattening, that's when I know personally that I want to go do something else. And so, yeah, that's been a guiding force for me it kind of is why I went to Dropbox in the first place, because the job I had at the moment, I wasn't learning quite as much as I knew I would going to work as a first employee at a company. And then that's why I left Dropbox, because at that time I felt like my gradient was flattening out, and that I knew by being a founder, I could jump in and do something that would kind of teach me a ton. And then in terms of like what I wanted to learn, I think that has changed a lot, very dependent on kind of where I am. But when I was leaving Dropbox, specifically the things I was hoping to learn were primarily around what it's like to start a company that doesn't immediately have product market fit. Because everything I had ever seen at Dropbox was like, oh yeah, this thing works, like everyone loves it. We just need to like keep building to like satisfy what the market wants. And I missed out on all the lessons that everyone else seems to learn with their startups, which is, oh, we tried something and it didn't work. And so I
Yeah.
decided, in order to learn that, I have to do this myself. And to summarize that process, I tried and failed a lot of things. So
Yeah.
it was super valuable from that perspective. Although, not something that's quite as exciting to talk about, framed in this like success oriented metric, which I think more people approach their career with.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of lessons in failure. I mean, I think for my second startup, their first product around recruiting, we didn't charge enough by an order of magnitude. And it's one of these things where like, oh, pricing's important. And it's not like I wasn't thinking about pricing at the time. So it's also like, well, how did you make such a big mistake? And you can't help as a founder to like own that a little bit, but it also highlights that there's just always so much to learn in every dimension. I think that's one reason why founding a company is so valuable for learning, is because there's just nobody else to do anything. And so if you don't know how to sign a lease or do accounting or make somebody an offer to, or convince somebody to come work with you, or raise money, or build a product and find your first customers, you can just go on and on and on and on. It's probably the hardest part about starting a company, is just the torrent of everything, and it just never stops. And so I went through a recent IPO while at Lyft, and Drew and Arash went through the same thing. And I give this as an example when talking about starting a company, because it's like, so even Dropbox passed Series D, or Lyft Series G, H, I don't even know where they were by the time they IPO'd. It's like, did the founders, had they ever IPO'd? No. And so there's like a continuous, constant torrent of things you need to learn, and you have to want that, which is interesting culturally, because it's not for everybody. And so one thing interesting about Lyft is, just in my own most recent experience after they acquired my second startup, was it was an almost IPO'd company. So you had thousands of people that were there, and so the people that I met wanted to work for a company that was close to IPO, but still like felt startup-y a little bit. And there's a bunch of reasons why people are at Lyft, so people can quote, climate change or other things like that. But generally, I found it interesting that it's not, it's like, if there's a dimension of like starting a company and you want to take on that risk and learn all these things and work really, really hard, versus, I'll get paid pretty well at a pretty big company that's probably going to IPO. So like you have like lower variance. There's a cultural difference on the people that choose one or the other. And so generally, and this is like self-serving a little bit because I'm going into investing, and you're an active angel as well. I would love for many, many more people to go start companies. And so what do you think could help people understand why it's for them? I'll put it that way. In terms of the thousands and thousands of people that have joined Facebook and Google and Apple, these very large, successful companies recently, that are probably not thinking this startup is for me. How do you think we could like sway the culture to get more folks doing it themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really big question, and I certainly won't have a satisfactory answer to solve it all. But I think, with respect to this question about, if you hypothesize there's a set of people who are probably about skills wise ready to be founders, and if they looked at kind of the upside of being a founder in terms of what they were going to learn and what they were going to have access to be able to do, and the impact that they could have in the world, would be really interested in it, but still aren't starting companies. I think it's a really interesting question to ask, like, what's in the gap? In my experience, there's actually one really, really, really big thing that's in the gap that's often, it goes unacknowledged. And it's this sense of security, this sense that where you are in life is such that no amount of a failure that comes in this business can bring you down. That like your set point is just like at a pretty comfortable place. And I knew coming out of school that I probably wasn't quite at that set point, but I didn't like worry about it very much. And I think that's why it's often easier to get like younger entrepreneurs, because people, especially, you see people in high school or people during college starting companies. It's like, well, I just don't even have a sense about what the downside could be. I live with my parents, like I live in my dorm. And as you just get slightly older, you're like, oh wait, I have to pay rent. Oh wait, like there are other people in my life who I may have to support. Especially as you go even further. I just had kids last year. You start to build these things up where you could say to yourself, I'm not maybe at a point where I feel comfortable failing, or I'm not at a point where I feel comfortable taking this sort of a risk. And so when I think about interventions, like let's say like concrete things we want to do societally in order to make more entrepreneurs, all of the things are along those lines of how do you get someone to a set point where they feel really comfortable. So I think part of it is psychological or emotional, but a good part of it is just about like money, unfortunately. Do you have enough of it? Do you have enough wealth, I guess I should say? Maybe money's not the only part of it, but do you have enough in your life that you know that you're going to be okay? And the more people we can get to that place, I think we'll just automatically get more entrepreneurs. So zooming back out to society level, this makes me kind of be in favor of UBI. And there's a lot of details there that we could get into. I probably am not so in favor of it in like broadest sense, but it's certainly true that the more people who get a UBI, at some margin, there are people who are like in a better financial state. In kind of the more micro scale, so think about like if you were a VC firm trying to like recruit people, is potentially to go to people who are already at these companies. So maybe you say work in those companies is a mistake, but I expected out of college to go work at one of the major tech companies because I knew that they would help me create that life. And so there's some people who probably you met working at Lyft who were like pretty comfortable and just needed just a little bit of a nudge. And so I think, that's a concrete thing for sure, is to find the people who are there, and to like just remind them like, hey, you got there. And for the people who aren't there yet, maybe to encourage them to take that step in their career to say, go work at a thing that's way less risky, but is way more likely to give you that stability or that like comfort. And that's going to mean that I'm going to come back to you in a few years and ask you why you haven't left yet.
Yeah, there's so much there. I mean, the comfort is an interesting side to this because I think I see Taleb talks about two most addictive things in the world are heroin and biweekly paycheck, because what happens is you make more money and then you're like, oh, reasonably, I make a budget. What can I afford? The space I can have, my car payment, all these things you could think about investing in, and it's not really an investment. It's like you're spending the money and then you don't have it, and you make obligations. And so it's very hard to stay grounded on what you really need. And this is why college is so valuable as far as like dorm room startups, is because, and I think Dropbox falls in this category, Facebook falls in this category, the attitude of the founders was very much relative depravity. I'll put it that way. Just like you don't spend a lot of money. You don't need a lot of things. You definitely need to like have a roof over your head and you need food. But a lot of other things, and like what quality of food, how nice of a place you live in, how many people are living there, it's all variable. And for me personally, congrats on the recent fatherhood. I did my first startup when we had a 8-month-old, and it was actually causal. I think in part because related to this, because when you have a kid, at least when I had a kid, I think every parent is like this. It's obviously the most important thing in your life, like the new thing. It's like just so important. And so when you think about like comfort or what you need, you really can like focus, because you really just need your family to be okay. And so when you think about that and like what does it take for your family to be okay, you think like let's say the startup doesn't work out, presuming you don't do something that's a very bad idea, like getting a lot of debt, like credit card debt or something like that. Presuming you don't do that, the worst case scenario is I have to get another job, like the one I have now, that is very comfortable and paying me a lot of money. And so your family is going to be fine. And of course, you could get more nuance there of like working 100-hour weeks versus more normal 60, 70-hour weeks, like for your company. But having a kid sort of freed me to think about what really, really mattered, and realizing like the downside is just not very down because it's not going to affect my family. And what's interesting about that is I think sort of there's a level of conscientiousness here where a lot of people assume less risk in their career when they have a family to take care of. But those are two different dimensions. You're not really risking your family when you can always just get a job. And there's certainly a level of, like in tech, I'm very confident that a software engineer can find a job. So I am talking about some of the most powerful working group that we're talking about here. So it's, putting that in context. But it is interesting how it's definitely like a psychological thing in terms of where do you want to put your risk and when are you comfortable in order to make the leap. That makes a lot of sense though.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to acknowledge though, society has always been a little bit like split between what you might call more elite, like very well educated group, and then kind of a group that doesn't have as much access, certainly doesn't have as much wealth, doesn't have as much opportunity. And so I think in the ideal case, what we're really talking about is bridging the gap. But it's super hard. It's super hard. And so, yes, within the group of people who are relatively more privileged, I think there's a ton of kind of on the margin stuff to bring out more entrepreneurs, and I hope that we do. And then what I hope is that those folks take their power and resources and start to help bridge that gap. So part of bridging that gap, again, is just what can we do to like give people a sense of economic stability. And I think it's not just good for making entrepreneurs, it's also good for society.
Sure, yeah.
And what can we do to open up some pathways into, kind of this world of entrepreneurial thought, which is a thing about like education. I actually went to a talk recently. I was speaking about kind of how dangerous it is to have all of this kind of wealth and productivity concentrated in just a few places. So, from my perspective, basically like New York, San Francisco are the only two places where you can kind of reliably do a tech startup, quote unquote. And it's an interesting thing to ask, like, what if rather than having those two places that dominate, the kind of opportunity was spread across the entire nation, right? There's plenty of places that have people who can learn to be technologists. There's plenty of, basically everyone I know came from somewhere else. I know very few people working and living in Silicon Valley who are born and raised here. And even the ones I do know, most of them are immigrants. And so like recent immigrants, and so like the model of trying to like more broadly spread kind of the magic that we're talking about being an entrepreneur and building these businesses based on technology is like a really, really interesting thing that I have zero solutions for, but I love as an ideal and something that, as folks become more successful can start to think about.
Yeah, there's it's definitely worth separating out a few different groups because there's folks that aren't technical that could be technical. And that might mean working really hard and going to a college that does that. I think one of the most wonderful things about software engineering is how, especially because the tools are built by software engineers, you could, given enough will, learn it. And it's very rare to meet, it's impossible to meet a lawyer that did a 3-month boot camp and now they're like, they passed the bar, or like a doctor it's like about to operate on you. It's like, oh, what's your training? It's like, I was on this class for a little bit and, I tried it on one or two other people, move fast and break things. It's like, it's actually so democratized, specifically in tech and software engineering. And and it's not for everything, so certain kinds of like hardware engineering, like material science or other things like that, I don't think are nearly as easy as learning Python or data science. But it is one of these things where, at least software engineering specifically, it's a similar kind of story where it's like, hey, this is for you. Because there's a bunch of other people that have done this and they didn't necessarily have to break into the institution to be able to do it. It's just a matter of going and doing it. And it's almost like the similar entrepreneurial attitude of like owning the goal and doing what it takes to achieve it. This is actually probably a good transition to talk more a bit about DevColor and its mission and what it's for, because I think there's, just think about it like people getting into tech, people in tech being supported, and then founders, and then those founders being supported, becoming successful, and like you said, helping others do the same thing. And so why don't you talk me through a little bit about the mission and the programs and what DevColor is all about?
Yeah, so DevColor, as I mentioned before, is a program or a nonprofit built around Black software engineers. And our goal ultimately is to get Black software engineers to grow as leaders, technical leaders, non-technical leaders within industry. And from that position, I think there's a ton of opportunity for us to kind of go back and rebuild the world, really, to be more equitable and all those great things. Our particular model of change is very interesting. There's a lot of nonprofits that are built around the people who work in the nonprofit doing the work to help the people who need it. A really simple example might be I run a food kitchen, so people come to us and we like give them food and then they eat it and they're fed. DevColor actually is built completely around structuring the environment for Black software engineers to help themselves. So it starts with this premise that the power is kind of within the community as it stands, and that all that's kind of needed is enough structure to help people, build their networks and have others to commiserate with and or celebrate with or all of those things. And we've seen just kind of fantastic results over the 5 years that the program's been running. One in that, some of my best friends are from DevColor and are in my squad, which is what we call these peer mentoring groups we run. But also that we're seeing, promotions and raises and all sorts of career advancement. And, to the earlier conversation, we're seeing all sorts of people who formerly felt like they just wanted to break into tech because it was a way for them to start getting some economic freedom to now move over into the entrepreneurial world and, to start companies and, fail, but be able to get right back up and get a nice check job and keep that system going. So that's kind of what we're about. And, as I mentioned, we're so oriented around facilitating that as an org, as opposed to doing the work ourselves, which I think is just a reflection of the fact that the person who started it, Macandé Adiagbo, was himself in tech. So we think about these things as a technologist would, which is how do we get scale? How do we get leverage on a personal basis? How can you take what we have now, which is a staff of 8, and serve a membership of 500? And then take that same, that was staff that was serving 250 a couple years ago, right? So that's sort of a leverage or that sort of like impact that grows separate from direct work and relying on the power of the network and relying on, to be honest, like actually a little bit of software that we wrote that our members, it's kind of open source within our community that our members work on. That's how we get to scale and how we get to impact without having to have a budget that grows by $1 million for every 100 engineers we want to bring on or whatever the case may be.
So what do you think it's going to take for that 500 to go to 5,000 to go to 50,000, which might actually at that point cover ballpark the Black software engineers in the United States? Actually, I don't know the numbers here, but
I think there should be more Black software engineers than that. But it's kind of difficult on the statistics because the government doesn't really have a category for what we call software engineers. It kind of has like IT as a group.
Which covers a lot. I meant to ask just more like, what do you think it takes to scale? Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think part of it is just we're still learning, right? So we take a very iterative approach to our program development. So there are certain things that we know are working, and we are able to kind of take those and transport them. But a lot of those things, although they work, we still don't have the part that I was just speaking about of scale. So for some of the things that we think work best, we just would need more staff in order to expand. So there's kind of a little ratchet there between we have to grow our budget in order to afford the staff in order to give us the ability to do the expansion. But once the expansion is there, it kind of flywheels. But I think the other part of it, which is interesting, is just that we're still selling the idea of a professional network built around identity, personal identity. And I think within the nonprofit world, it's kind of uninteresting. Obviously, you kind of build something that if you want to help Black software engineers, awesome. If you want to help like Latino PMs, that's awesome. Like the whole thing is just, yeah, why wouldn't that be paired? But I think there is a sense about people wanting their professional to sit separate from their personal. And so I think we have a long way to go in terms of helping even members of our own community see what the value can be of this kind of cross-cutting org. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of a marketing question maybe, or maybe it's a
Mm.
question of our ability to kind of like explain what we do. Because it's not a traditional nonprofit, it's not us like actually making people's careers better. It's giving them the tools and the network to make their careers better. And so, yeah, the combination of those two of like still working out our model and getting it fully to be able to scale, and then getting the word out and getting people to understand. So I would summarize all of that as it's only a matter of time. I
Mm.
think we've done pretty well for the first 5 years, and I'm looking forward to seeing what the next five brings us. But I hope we're much closer to that 5K or 10K number by that point, and maybe 50K within a decade.
So when it comes to the companies where these people work, do they get involved? I think I've heard McIntyre describe it to me before as sort of like an employee resource group, but that model is also, I think, kind of
Yeah,
shifting around.
we're
Um,
complementary to employee resource groups. I I don't in some ways I don't think we can be very useful there, because we our goal is not to kind of collect all of the people from a certain company and like kind of help them with things that are internal to their company. That's not what we do. It's much more individual based, and in fact, we go out of our way to make sure people from the same company are not paired together in our core
mm,
programming, because it kind of gets in the way of some of these other goals that we have. That said, yes, we have some really really great partners. I won't go through naming them, but they're many of the biggest companies in the Bay Area, and they're supportive of our program for a few reasons. One of them, obviously, because we serve a demographic that they think is really important. Like it's just really important for Black software engineers to be a part of the technology ecosystem, and so they want to be a part of that story. Two, in almost every case, they have our members working at their company, and sort of selfishly, they want the people who work at their company to be as productive and kind of as technically able as possible, or the best leaders that they can be, or all the other things that kind of come out of the program. And so their business is benefiting from having people in our program, and they want to reflect that by like giving back. The third way is that our partners kind of come together in a separate program, which I didn't talk about at all, but we engage our partners in conversations around diversity and inclusion topics, around social justice topics, around general kind of areas of interest that they often don't get to talk about in any other context. And so that program is really, really valuable for them as well.
so I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you think companies can help, whether with DevColor or outside, in terms of making the best environment to develop Black engineers.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I'm actually going to take the opportunity to scope it like a little bit wider, to not just talk about Black software engineers, but also talk about just kind of the broader set of people who are underrepresented in kind of the environments that you typically find in tech. So
Mm,
one little preamble is, on a personal basis, I have very, very, very often been the only, which is like a nice phrase I like to use around kind of how you come into a space. I'm very often the only Black person um, in a tech company. It's been that way in many places that I've worked. Dropbox for sure when I joined there, and the only time there was another Black software engineer at Dropbox with me was when I temporarily brought Mackaday, who founded DevColor, over there. Um, so yeah, I'm used to that. I'm also often the only person from the southeast of the United States
hmm.
at companies I work at, which brings its own kind of cultural baggage or kind of understanding of the world. There's a lot of onlys that I end up kind of finding myself living. And I think personally, I have a very different experience than a lot of people, because I relish being the only. It's really exciting to me. It's part of like my curiosity that I like going into spaces that are maybe not like for me, or maybe not typically thought of as spaces that I might be excited about, and I can learn something. That's awesome. That's something that I get excited about. I also really enjoy kind of subverting expectations, and so you kind of see a guy with a crazy afro, and there's certain things that maybe you think about those type of people, and I'm that for sure. But I'm also other things, and it's like fun for me to think about someone who kind of is a little bit different than what you would normally see. I think the average person is not like that at all. And so the fundamental thing that I think we as a community in tech can do to help bring underrepresented people in is just acknowledge the fact that most people don't want to be the only or one of the few of anything they do in life. That's much more comfortable for most people to come into a room where everyone around them is really, really like them. So Dev Color as an organization is built on that principle. Like we can do this same intervention with any software engineers or probably anyone in any uh, professional setting, but we choose Black software engineers such that, at least in this setting, they won't be the only. In fact, everybody will be what they are. And there's a certain comfort that comes from that. And it is basically impossible for most companies to create effectively the reality of large parts of our society, which are majority minority. So California, for example, is majority minority, but you will not find any tech companies that are majority minority, I don't think, at least not at scale. Because it's just really hard to um, change kind of these systematic things that lead to it.
Mm.
But on the micro scale, like what can you do to make the places where you are more welcoming to people who are from the outside? I think the number one thing is to try to make sure that when you invite someone in, that they won't be the only one there. That's kind of the summary. How do you do that? Some ways are creating events or spaces where you are trying to over-index on a certain demographic. So this might be programming to invite, and Dropbox did a lot of this, invite women just to come to campus, just to be in the building, to run whatever programming makes the most sense for them, and to have Dropbox be a part of that conversation. When it comes to recruiting, it may mean, and we really struggle with this at Dropbox, when you're hiring the first woman, it either needs to be someone who is excited to be the first, the only, or you need to hire like more than one woman at a time. And so bringing in these cohorts of underrepresented people is also something that can be really, really impactful. And it's kind of work that you can do that doesn't require kind of putting on the social justice shield and really like taking a big stand in terms of society. It's just something you can do as a company, is just to be really aware of these effects. I think another thing which is probably like underrated, but to be honest, I think is just valuable to when you see someone who isn't only in an environment to just like acknowledge it and to talk about it, which can be awkward. And I've been on the other side where I'm like one of the very many men in a room with like one woman. And it takes like a little bit of doing to say like, oh, well, I want to hear from this voice because this is a person who must know that she's marginalized here. But you know, again, I'm led by curiosity. I want to know what she wants to say, not as a representative of women, not as a way to like school us men, but because being the only is like a tough spot, and
Mm.
it's worth like giving people some room to live in and to get more comfortable with over time. Maybe we can, in the same way we kind of breed entrepreneurs, we can breed people who are excited to be the only. Um, but in the meantime, I think it's super worthwhile just to try to make those folks more comfortable.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting from a recruiting perspective too, because recruiters will take any effective channel they can get. And so if there's something that's better for your culture and better for a recruiting pipeline, it's like it's a thing in marketing where if you have like a narrower audience, you can typically have a more custom and more effective message. So I see this, it's not just because it's good, it's because it'll be very effective as well. Is that
Totally.
you'll get better at recruiting by this kind of focus.
Totally. And so to give some concrete things there, I mean, I think it's really important to go recruit from places that have concentrations of people who are underrepresented. So very common strategy is to go to a historically black college university to recruit black people. Um, but one thing to do is women are very overrepresented in almost every major in college. but typically not in engineering. So we should be spending more time trying to recruit women who are very talented out of majors that maybe have a great path towards software, but don't look directly like software.
Mm.
Because I think that those are the sorts of things that, like, again, like economically, it's just the right thing for companies to do. Um, there's so much talent out there that's not being tapped. And by doing that, you have a situation where you have a whole class of people who are being recruited from like this shared understanding. So they, at least in the recruiting process, they're not the only, which is a really big deal.
I hired someone through Hackbright Academy, which is
Yes.
a boot camp focused on women. And just from that, self-serving recruiting perspective, it's a very effective channel because depending on who you're trying to hire, but if you have room for someone relatively early in their career and you have a company that can do mentorship, it's something we could really excel. And we got someone that I think is a genius. It's like it's worked out really, really well. So it's one of these things.
It turns out that you're kind of like, there's certain areas of talent that are just totally overpicked, and you pay for that.
Yeah, yeah,
And then there's
yeah.
areas that are underpicked, and it's all upside. So yeah, it's huge. I think it's a that Hackbright is a great example, and there are plenty more. We, funny enough, companies come to DevColor and they're like, well, how can we do a better job of hiring Black software engineers out of your membership? And it's like, well, good news, they already have jobs. They're really happy about. So I typically encourage folks to kind of look elsewhere, right? We work with a pretty small group of people who are already kind of seeing that success, but who's on the outside. And as these companies can start to bring more people in the industry, we're happy to catch and support and help
Yeah.
build them up.
It's definitely something I appreciate about DevColor, where a lot of people talk about a funnel and how you need to source and get people in the front door, but then your focus is on what happens after that, which is definitely an area that is just as important, but not nearly given as much attention. So I'm delighted you guys exist. And so if folks want to learn more and dive into DevColor or how to support you, where should they go?
Yeah, so we've got devcolor.org. And if you stop by there, you'll be able to learn a lot more about our mission, about our approach. There's donate link if you're down to give, but we pretty much don't rely on individual contributions. So I care much more, given your audience, about what people can do in their own lives around people who are marginalized, whether they're Black software engineers or not, trying to give space for them to feel comfortable, so comfortable that they can succeed in their jobs, so comfortable that they can start new companies. And I
Mm.
think if all of us can do that in a micro way, it makes for like this huge macro effect, which again, if you want to support DevColor to be a part of that, dope. If not, do it your own way.
Awesome. Well, on that note, thank you so much for taking the time, Aston.
Thanks so much, Yvonne. Glad to be here.